dry land too. These are the words of the Lord for the people of God.
Little background before I read. Peter was the first disciple chosen according to Matthew's gospel. And in that way, he becomes throughout the gospel sort of the typical disciple. He's sort of a stand-in for everybody. Occasionally, he models great faithfulness and fearlessness, and other times he demonstrates a shameless lack of courage, and sometimes he's just a clueless dope who doesn't seem to pick up on anything that Jesus does or says. Immediately prior to the text that I'm going to read is Matthew's version of Jesus feeding the 5,000. Peter and the other disciples have just observed Jesus' great compassion in responding to this crowd of people who have gathered around. All Jesus wants to do is get away and pray by himself because he has just learned that his cousin, John the Baptist, was murdered by King Herod. And so Jesus apparently wants some time away to think about that, or to pray, or to grieve, or just to be by himself. But the people are flocking after him, and the disciples are wondering what they should do with all these hungry people. And so they watch him in the midst of his own sorrow, heal the sick, and then with only 5 loaves and 2 fish, feed 5,000 men, plus who knows how many thousands of women and children. God's generosity was evident to the disciples by the feeding, but also everybody walked away fed and filled, and there were 12 baskets of food left over. Peter has a really hard time understanding the miracles, the feeding, for instance. At this point, he's been with Jesus for a long time. He has witnessed the power of Jesus' presence. He has heard the forcefulness of his words, and he has seen the strength of Jesus' love for God. And having just witnessed this divine feeding of an enormous crowd, a crowd that Peter wanted to send away and let them figure out their own meal, Peter finds himself in the sort of awkward position of about to get into a boat where he's going to experience his own kind of miracle. So let us listen for God's word. Immediately, Jesus made the disciples get into the boat and go on ahead to the other side while he dismissed the crowd. And after Jesus had dismissed the crowds, he went up the mountain by himself to pray. When evening came, he was there alone, but by this time the boat, battered by the waves, was far from the land, for the wind was against them. And early in the morning, Jesus came walking toward them on the sea. But when the disciples saw him walking on the sea, they were terrified, saying, "It's a ghost!" And they cried out in fear. But immediately Jesus spoke to them and said, "Take heart, it is I, do not be afraid." Peter answered him, "Lord, if it is you, command me to come to you on the water." Jesus said, "Come." So Peter got out of the boat, started walking on the water, and came toward Jesus. But when he noticed the strong wind, he became frightened and began to sink. He cried out, "Lord, save me." Jesus immediately reached out his hand and caught him, saying to him, "You of little faith, why did you doubt?" When they got into the boat, the wind ceased. And those in the boat worshiped him, saying, "Truly you are the Son of God." One of the great challenges of parenting for me, especially when my girls were young, was finding a healthy balance between teaching appropriate caution without making them afraid of everything and everyone. To hear them tell it today, I may, at times, with the best intentions and commitment to their well-being, I may have had a slight tendency toward overprotection. It is not that I wanted them to be afraid. It is that I wanted them to be safe. Their suggestion that I would have put them in bubble wrap if I could have is slightly exaggerated. But you know how it is with kids, right? They have no fear. Most toddlers, thankfully, don't know that there's anything to be afraid of. And so they barrel through life like drunk monkeys, jumping on furniture, swinging on things, putting stuff in their mouths, chasing shiny objects, exploring the world with unbridled enthusiasm. Teenagers, on the other hand, they just can't imagine anything bad could ever happen to them. And so they too put stuff in their mouths and chase shiny objects and drive too fast and text when they shouldn't and fail to consider the consequences of their actions as they explore the world with curiosity and enthusiasm, all while wearing braces and going through puberty. It is a rough combination. And so parents in our family, the mother occasionally felt compelled to point out the potential dangers of their behaviors, as well as every other possible threat in the whole world. Eventually, I think I really lightened up a lot. They disagree, but I did realize at some point that I couldn't protect them from everything. And as terrifying as that was for me, it did give me permission to sort of ease up a bit. I recognized at some point that my anxiety was getting the best of all of us. And so I learned over time to just bite my tongue and pray most of the time, rather than inflicting all my neuroses on them. Because living in fear is no way to live. There's just so much to be afraid of, right? We fear death, all of us, at some level, I think, our own, or at least the deaths of the ones we love. We fear disease and disability. We fear the loss of security and success and reputation. We fear failure and what others think about us. We fear being out of control and powerless. We fear the unknown. We fear change. We fear pain. We fear others, especially those who look and act and believe differently than we do. We fear snakes and sharks and spiders and heights and depths and speaking in public, if you believe all of the quizzes. We fear not being enough, and we fear being found out that we're not enough. And the list goes on and on. Fear drives and controls a lot of us. But like a bad mirror at an amusement park, fear distorts our view, making things seem bigger and therefore scarier than they actually might be. As one writer said, fear often determines the choices we make, the words we say, the actions we take, the prayers we offer. That's why fear is one of the most potent and effective tools used by politicians to get votes and influence behavior. And the media uses it too, to grab our attention and then to keep us from turning away. We are being called to fear constantly in our culture. And yet, when we read the scriptures, we find that the most common thing that God says to God's people is, do not be afraid. But we know what it's like to be in a boat battered by waves, far from land with the wind against us. And we know what it feels like to be caught in a storm that comes up unexpectedly. And we know what it is to see ghosts and to cry out in terror. And we know what it is to be overwhelmed by a darkness so encompassing that we can't even see our hand in front of our face. And we know what it is to be far from a safe harbor and hopeless that we'll ever get back to it. We know what it's like to be those disciples in that boat, crying out to be rescued from difficult circumstances, praying to be liberated from the chaos and placed gently and unscathed on dry land. And that's not what happens in the story. Jesus doesn't take them out of the storm. Jesus comes to them in the midst of the storm, walking on water to reach them in the darkness and the wind and the waves, speaking calmly to them in the midst of their terror. And he doesn't berate them or shame them for their fear. He says, guys, it's me. Don't be afraid. I'm here. But for Peter, this is a moment, right? In his impulsivity, kind of like a toddler or a teenager, he asks Jesus if he can do the cool water walking trick too. And Jesus says, go for it. And so Peter steps out of that boat and moves toward his Lord. Of course, he doesn't get very far when he focuses not on Jesus, but on the wind and the churning sea and the watery darkness that surrounds him. And his attention falters, and he begins to sink. But still, it's a gutsy move. Writer Amy Hunter tells about a classmate at her evangelical Christian college who repeatedly defined faith as stepping out of airplanes knowing that God will catch you. And Hunter's response was that surely God had better things to do than catch people who were stupid enough to step out of airplanes. And I think I agree with that. But her classmate's view is sort of common these days, although it's really bad theology. The idea that God ensures a kind of impenetrable bubble to protect us from any harm, even that which is self-inflicted. The message of this text isn't if Peter had had enough faith, he could have walked on water, just as the message to us is not if we had enough faith, we could overcome all of our problems in spectacular ways, raise perfectly cautious yet fearless children, believe ourselves out of cancer and diabetes and heart disease, defy the effects of aging, always be happy, and never die. The reality is that accidents and disease and aging and hardships and stupidity afflict even people of faith. And sometimes we begin to sink a little bit. But I don't think we should feel guilty because of our lack of faith. And I say that because look at what happens when Peter finds his fear returning and his trust wavering and his feet sinking into the lake. He says, Lord, save me, the cry of generations. And that's exactly what Jesus does, reaching out to give him a hand, a strong and sure and compassionate grip to hold on to. Jesus doesn't reject or condemn or lecture Peter for his shaky faith. He asks, as a helpful friend might, or as a parent would say to a frightened child, why'd you doubt me? As if to say, I'm always here, right next to you. When you struggle, just ask. I'll help. After all, it was Jesus' love for Peter and the others that sent him walking on the water to them in the first place. The disciples were in a literal storm on the Sea of Galilee. The church, to which Matthew wrote his version of the gospel some 50 years later, found itself in the midst of a storm as well. They were experiencing a turbulent relationship with the Jewish synagogues they were continuing to be a part of. The Roman government was becoming more intrusive and more oppressive toward Christians, and the boat became a symbol of the church in those early years. Tom Long, a Presbyterian pastor and writer, says that the end of the story is where the church always wants to be, in still waters, worshiping God together. But he writes, Sunday isn't the only day of the week, and the church doesn't exist to float around in a Sabbath sea all by itself, praising Jesus. In fact, I think if we're truly living the life of discipleship to which we are called, we are going to find ourselves individually and as a church more often than not on stormy seas instead of in safe harbors. Dietrich Bonhoeffer was a pastor in the German Lutheran Church during the rise of Hitler and the storm that was Nazi Germany. Hitler tried, and sadly was quite successful, at using the church in Germany to spread the gospel of nationalism and anti-Semitism. And Bonhoeffer was a vocal critic of the regime who was imprisoned and eventually executed for his opposition. In his powerful book, The Cost of Discipleship, Bonhoeffer wrote about this text. Peter had to leave the ship and risk his life on the sea in order to learn both his own weakness and the almighty power of his Lord. If Peter hadn't taken the risk, he never would have learned the meaning of faith. The road to faith passes through obedience to the call of Jesus. Unless a definite step is demanded, the call vanishes into thin air. And if people imagine that they can follow Jesus without taking this step, they are deluding themselves like fanatics. Faith is only real where there is obedience, never without it. And faith only becomes faith in an act of obedience. We have to keep glimpsing new possibilities within ourselves, even as we are so aware of our limitations, especially when we're afraid. And it's only natural to be afraid and to doubt in the face of danger and stress. God doesn't demand that we don't feel fear, that we don't wonder and doubt. God only desires that we find our strength in the promise that Jesus is right there with us all the time, just waiting for us to grab a hold of his hand. Faith isn't about being able to walk on water. Only God can do that. But it's about daring to believe in the face of all the evidence that God is with us in the boat, made real in the community of faith as it makes its way through whatever storm, battered by the waves. Thanks be to God.